Once upon a time, there was a little engine called Edward. He lived in a shed with 5 other engines. They were all bigger than Edward and boasted about it. The driver won't choose you again, they said. He wants big, strong engines like us. Edward had not been out for a long time. He began to feel sad. Just then, the driver and fireman came along to start work. The driver looked at Edward. "Why are you sad?" he asked. "Would you like to come out today?" "Yes, please," said Edward. So the fireman lit the fire and made a nice lot of steam. Then the driver pulled the lever and Edward puffed away. He whistled. "Look at me now." The others were very cross at being left behind.
Good morning, everybody! This is the TSMU fan here, and today, the Railway Series, the book series that the famous Thomas and Friends television show is based on, has turned a whopping 80 years old. It's hard to believe that so much time has passed by since the first publication of the 3 railway engines, especially since last year, the television series celebrated its 40th anniversary. I guess you know what they say, time flies when you're having fun. To honor the Railway Series' 80th anniversary, I'm going to tell you the backstory of the author behind it, how these books came to fruition, and the legacy that they left behind. So please join me as we travel back in time to 1942. Our story begins in Kings Norton, Birmingham, where a reverend under the name of Wilbert Vere Awdry lived with his wife Margaret and his son Christopher. Christopher was unfortunately sick in bed with the measles, and as a result, he had to stay inside and rest his eyes. His illness was causing him to become quite bored sitting in bed all day, so Wilbert would often tell his son nursery rhymes to keep him entertained. One rhyme, however, stood out against all the others. It was the nursery rhyme Down by the Station, which covered the daily routine of getting steam engines ready for work in the early morning. Christopher loved the rhyme, and Wilbur even recalled that
there'd be a delighted chorus at the end.
Yes.
Puff, puff, chuff, chuff, off we go.
Wilbur even illustrated a picture of the steam engines all in a row for Christopher since he loved the rhyme so much. The engines were all illustrated from a head-on perspective, which was the easiest way for Wilbur to draw them. However, this left a lot of blank space on the smoke boxes, so just for fun, Wilbert decided to give the steam engines faces on the smoke boxes, all with different expressions. One engine was illustrated with a sad expression, and it was this engine that young Christopher related to the most, since he was so bedridden with his sickness. He pointed the engine out to his father and asked him, "Why is he sad, Daddy?" Wilbert came up with the answer, "Because he's old and hasn't been out for a long time." Christopher then asked him, "What's his name, Daddy?" And then, history was made. Wilbert replied to his son with the first name that popped into his head: Edward. Yup. That's right, Thomas was not the first character created, even though he's Sodor's number 1. It was actually Edward, Sodor's number 2. Crazy, right? But anyways, by question and answer, Wilbert invented a story for Edward called Edward's Day Out. It was very much inspired by the classic fairy tale Cinderella, in which the one who is always looked down on and made fun of gets to experience recognition and success. Christopher loved the story of Edward's Day Out so much that Wilbert told him another story which was about Edward interacting with a larger express tender engine named Gordon, who was named after a bossy little boy who lived down the road from where the Awdrys lived. This was reflected in the character himself, as Gordon was very big and proud since he pulled express passenger trains. However, in this story he is assigned to goods work, and grumbling dreadfully, gets stuck on a hill and Edward is called to help push him. When Wilbur was a child, he lived some 200 yards from the western end of the box tunnel. At that point, the Great Western Main Line climbed for some 2 miles at a gradient of 1 in 100. A banking engine was kept there to assist freight trains up the hill. Wilbert noted that, "There was no doubt in my mind that steam engines all had definite personalities. I would hear in the puffings and pantings of the 2 engines the conversation they were having with each other. This was the inspiration for Gordon and Edward's chanting as they hauled the heavy train up the steep hill.
I can't do it. I can't do it. I will do it. I will do it.
Again, after this story was told to Christopher, he demanded to hear another one, so Wilbur obliged and drew inspiration from another rhyme of which his son was fond of.
Once an engine attached to a train was afraid of a few drops of rain. It went into a tunnel and squeaked through its funnel and never came out again.
Surprisingly enough, a similar variant of this rhyme had appeared in a book of children's rhymes named Nonsense Nonsense, which was published in 1902. Wilbur thought it possible that one of his family members might have had a copy of this book, which is where Wilbur may have seen the rhyme from and recalled it to entertain Christopher. Once again, his son was left with questions and asked his father, "Why didn't he like the rain, Daddy?" Wilbur replied with, "Because he thought the rain would spoil his green paint and red stripes." Christopher again asked what the name of this engine was, and his father again used the first name that came into his head: Henry. These stories remained favorites with young Christopher, even after he recovered from his sickness. "We had to tell them over and over and over again," recalled Wilbur, "and as you had to tell the story in the same way, using the same words, I wrote them down on the back of old circulars." Christopher even recalled that, "I got to know the stories so well that I began to correct Father when he went wrong. So he wrote them down as a form of self-defense, so he could get the words right the next time." At first, these stories were only intended for family use, but then Wilbur's wife Margaret started comparing them with other stories back then that were being published for children. "I had seen books in shops which I didn't think very much of," she recalled, "and I went home and said to Wilbur, 'I think yours are quite as good. Why don't you do something about it?'" She had no idea of how a person would go about getting a book published, though, but after mentioning them in a letter to Wilbur's mother, she replied saying that a niece was married to someone who she thought was connected to a firm of literary agents. If Wilbur cared to send the stories, she would forward them. Wilbur agreed, but since there was no time to write out good copies of the stories, Wilbur sent off what he referred to as these dirty scraps of paper. They were sent to a published writer named Michael Barsley, who first offered the manuscript to Puffin Books, then to a publisher called Transatlantic Arts, but neither of them were interested. He then showed the stories to Edith Ray Gregerson, one of the directors of his own literary agents, World Press Features Ltd. She then wrote a letter to Mrs. Awdry saying that the 3 little books written by your son, The Sad Story of Henry, Edward's Day Out, and one without a title, which we have called Edward and Gordon, are most original and delightful. For the first of these reasons, they will not prove easy to dispose of, especially to those firms which publish for the parents of young children. But just like before, it was not easy to find a publisher for the stories. They were offered first to Chatto and Windus, who turned them down, as did Faber and Faber and Mr. Desmond Tuck of Raphael Tuck. But later on, in September of 1943, 6 months after the original handwritten manuscripts were given to Michael Barsley, Gregerson wrote in with some good news. The stories had been sent to Edmund Ward, who was a printer in Leicester, and he was enthusiastic to publish them in a good class style at a future date. At last, Awdry had a publisher that was interested in his work. Ward purchased the copyright in his titles for an outright fee rather than pay in advance and royalties, and offered a payment of £25. However, the illustrations would have to be redrawn by Ward's own artist, since the current ones weren't good enough for the book they had in mind. Wilbur was genuinely surprised that anyone was eager to purchase his stories. "I didn't really think of them as being books at all. I simply thought of them as stories made up to keep my young son amused, and therefore decided to accept Edmund Ward's offer despite the fact that he was disappointed in which the way his illustrations had been rejected." Wilbur expressed his hope that any artist chosen to illustrate his books should have a proper respect for the accuracy of railway detail. Then, 2 weeks after he sent that letter, Gregerson wrote that Awdry might see his stories in print sooner than was anticipated. Apparently, Edmund Ward had written to say that he was considering issuing Wilbur's stories not as separate books, but together in one book entitled The 3 Railway Engines. However, this news was met with a problem. In order to produce the book in the way Ward wanted, another story was required with illustrations. "It occurs to us," wrote Ward, "that a a suitable fourth story might well be about Edward, Henry, and Gordon. However, this was easier said than done, as the third story had ended with Henry getting bricked up in the tunnel where he had stopped to keep his paint from getting wet in the rain. Wilbur had never expected having to write Henry out of trouble, but he would certainly have to do so if there was to be a fourth story entitled Edward, Gordon, and Henry. Wilbur took on the challenge and wrote a fourth story about Henry being let out of the tunnel after Gordon breaks down pulling the express. By the end of 1943, Wilbur had completed his story and sent it to his agents, and Edmund Ward wrote to say that the new story rounds off the set very nicely and that an attractive little book can now be produced. With regard to the coming book, Edmund Ward had been curiously silent on the issue of the illustrations following Awdry's engineering detail. However, Wilbur's worries about them would not become evident for a while. The whole of 1944 passed without the 3 railway engines being published, and in February 1945, Edmund Ward explained that the delay was due to problems in obtaining paper, as it was hard to acquire during the Second World War. Printing, however, had now begun, and finished copies were promised by April. However, they finally arrived on May 12, 1945. Just days after the end of World War II. The print run was for 22,500 copies, and the book cost Edmund Ward a total of £1,569 to produce. But as pleased as Wilbur was seeing his stories finally in print, he was particularly disappointed with the illustrations, which turned out to be uninspired and inaccurate in his eyes. Although no illustrator was credited on the title page of the 3 railway engines, the pictures were by a lithographic artist named William Middleton, who Edmund Ward knew of through his printing connections. Middleton drew his pictures onto stone, for which he was paid £62. Unfortunately, Middleton, who was inexperienced as an illustrator, had little sense of scale and not much of an idea on how to draw people. As for the engines, each had a flat disc, which looked suspiciously as if it had been traced around a coin stuck on the front of the smoke box, on which the faces had been clumsily drawn. He also started what was to prove to be a long-running problem with Henry. Although the pictures I drew were crude, admitted Wilbur, with stick men and very elementary scenery, I was careful with the 3 engines. Each had a different wheel arrangement and shape so that Christopher could tell them apart easily. Wilbert's sketches for the original manuscript showed Henry as a 442 engine, but Middleton drew him looking very much like Gordon as a 462 engine. To add to the confusion of being able to discern the 2 characters, the book's final illustration depicted Henry having his coat changed from green to blue, after which he became almost indistinguishable from Gordon. This confusion of not being able to tell them apart remained until the book Henry the Green Engine, in which Henry has an accident and is sent to Crewe to be given a new shape. This new shape involved changing Henry's design to that of a real engine, a LMS Stanier Class 5, or otherwise known as a Black 5. But the problems with the illustrations and with Henry's design weren't the only problems. In the sad story of Henry, the text reads that they took up the old rails, built a wall in front of him, and cut a new tunnel. Wilbert's original sketches clearly showed Henry stuck in one tunnel, and this is why his being there presents the fat director with a problem. The tunnel that Henry had stopped in was gauntleted, which meant that the trains would run on a single line and could travel in either direction one at a time. In his final picture, Wilbert showed 2 tunnels. Middleton, however, showed 2 tunnels from the very beginning of the story, therefore making the illustrations inconsistent with the actual story. A few years after the book was first published, the then illustrator of the series, C. Reginald Dalby, was commissioned to make new illustrations for the book. However, he unfortunately redrew the same error that Middleton had done when he could easily have dug Henry out of his confusion. These problems over the illustrations aside, Wilbur Awdry's first book was a success and showed him to be a gifted storyteller. It was these characters and their humanity which gave Wilbert's stories an originality that was apparent from his very first book. By the time The 3 Railway Engines was published, Wilbert was already at work with another book. After writing the first book of stories, Wilbur decided to make Christopher a push-along model of Edward with coaches and trucks using odd bits of wood. The boiler was a piece of a broomstick and the wheels were slices of broomstick and dowel. Christopher also wanted a model of Gordon, but as this was rather too difficult to construct, Wilbur instead made him a model of a little 060 tank engine instead, who would eventually become the most popular character in the Railway series. The natural name, he says, was Thomas. Thomas the Tank Engine. Thomas's book was published on September 14th, 1946. The book was of course a success, introducing us to the little blue tank engine who is now known globally across the world. Fun fact about Thomas, he didn't always look like how he looks now. Wilbur's original design for Thomas was based off of the model that he had made for Christopher, which looks very different from the Thomas that we know and love. It actually looked quite similar to the real-life Gressley J50 class tank engines, but instead of illustrating Thomas as the engine that Awdry intended, Reginald Payne, the then illustrator, illustrated Thomas as an E2 class tank engine. Payne himself was a Southern man, and so based Thomas off of a Southern engine. Although initially annoyed, Awdry was content after finding out that the design was based off of a real engine, and he allowed it to stay in the series. Thomas's book of course did well, but after it, Awdry was finished with writing any more books. However, due to popular demand, he pressed onward and wrote a third book about James, the engine Thomas saved in the final story of his book. Then he wrote another book, and another one, and another one, and another one, and another one, and so on and so forth. These books eventually came to be known as the Railway Series. Now that we've discussed the interesting backstory behind the first book and the success of it, which led to a whole series of books being published, let's move on and discuss the even more interesting history about the legacy these children's books left behind. Wilbur's books were of course very popular, and with such fame following Thomas and his friends, of course attempts were made to adapt the stories for television. The first attempt has quite the infamous history attached to it, so grab some popcorn and get comfortable as we dive into the 1953 sad story of Henry. In November of 1952, Robert Mitchell, who had just heard about the Railway Series books on the radio, wrote a letter to Frida Lindstrom, who was then in charge of the BBC's children's television department, asking if they could adapt Wilbur Awdry's stories for television. She agreed, and in February of the next year, the BBC wrote to Eric Marriott at Edmund Ward, who was the editor of the Railway Series, saying, "Our television department has in mind televising on 14th and 28th June 2 stories from the book The Three Railway Engines by the Reverend Awdry. In an offering of £1 per minute, R.G. Walford of the BBC's copyright department pointed out that it had not yet been decided which stories were to be used, and that, as they had to fit a 10-minute slot, they might require some editing to allow for the animation. This involved the use of 00 gauge miniature models with some scenic backings which were based on the illustrations. Although in principle terms were agreed upon, Wilbur was understandably concerned about authenticity. The BBC explained that they intended to use electrically operated Hornby models based on British rail designs which were similar, if not almost identical, with the illustrations in the book. The letter then went on to qualify that statement. It is true that there are certain differences. For example, the illustrations do not show any smoke deflector plates which are present on the Hornby models, but there is very little difference between the Hornby tank engine and the tank engine used for the illustrations. Quite a coincidence that Hornby would later go on to produce actual models of Thomas characters way later on, huh? Anyways, since the BBC explained that it is of immense value having someone control the engines electrically so that they can move forwards and backwards at will by means of switches, it can be assumed that they were unaware that Wilbur Awdry himself was a model railway enthusiast. Awdry did not agree with their statements of the models being similar to the ones in the illustrations, and Marriott therefore arranged that the models that were going to be used in the series should be sent to the publisher's offices in Leicester, so he could arrange for them to be suitably adapted. Meccano Ltd of Liverpool, who manufactured manufactured the Hornby engines, sent 3 Duchess of Atholl locomotives with tenders, while Douglas Mayer, who was to direct the films, sent the tank engine, all of which had to be suitably adapted and delivered to the BBC's Lime Grove studio in time for a rehearsal on Wednesday, June 10th. The cosmetic surgery, which also involved repainting the engines into their appropriate liveries, was undertaken by P.R. Wickham, an occasional collaborator of Wilbert's. On the appointed day, Eric Marriott delivered the engines to London and, on arriving at the studio, was immediately shunted into a cubicle and given a pile of railway sound effects records and asked to select the necessary sounds for use in the program. When he emerged some hours later, Marriott expected to see the engines going through their paces, only to find that Mayer was still some hours away from a rehearsal and that the set was not ready for the transmission. Marriott's disappointment was nothing compared with what he, Wilbert Awdry, and millions of viewers were to experience on the following Sunday afternoon. Although the program was only 10 minutes long, it was highly technical and was televised live. In addition to controlling the model engines and the studio cameras, the director had to cope with technical effects such as superimposed rain and people trying to get Henry out of the tunnel, music and effects cues, and live narration by Noel Middleton. The trains, Wilbert recalls, were soon jerking about all over the place, and it was during this live broadcast that one of the operators forgot to switch the points and the model depicting Henry derailed. Mayer explained in a letter that the derailment likely happened due to a faulty coupling that had caused trouble earlier during the first rehearsal. How did the crew respond to this accident? They reached down and tried to place Henry back onto the tracks while the episode was still being live broadcast. While the engine was derailed, Noel Middleton had to quickly adapt the script on the spot to fit the situation happening on the screen. This issue is definitely the most notable one in this broadcast, but if you thought that it was the only one, oh boy, it gets even better. Later during the broadcast, as reported by the program's organizer J.E. Rich, the model portraying Edward broke down. As a result, they had to replace Edward with James, right before a scene that was originally meant for Edward. As a result, the adventures became merely playing at trains. On June 22nd, Wilbert sent the BBC an ultimatum, stating that unless they avoided these mistakes in future episodes, he wanted them to cancel the show completely. This ultimatum from him made the front page in the Daily Mail, where Wilbert had put it as a matter of almost national concern. Cecil McGivern, head of programs at the BBC at the time, agreed with Awdry's comments and dubbed the entire endeavor pathetic. A lot of parents also sent him letters complaining about the broadcast, and these complaints, combined with negative media attention, resulted in the next episode's delay and the soon cancellation of the show. Guess they don't call it the sad story of Henry for nothing, huh? Despite the failure of this broadcast, Wilbert's books still remained very popular, and by the time Awdry retired from writing in 1972, the Railway Series numbered 26 books, with Wilbert's final book being Tramway Engines, published on October 15th, 1972. However, the story does not end here. Although the first attempt at televising the Railway Series in 1953 ultimately backfired, there was no lack of interest in trying again. In 1973, famous musical composer Andrew Lloyd Webber, who had read the Railway Series as a child, approached the publishers Kay and Ward with a proposal for a musical television series. At the time, Lloyd Webber was very much a rising talent. He had a number of meetings with Wilbert Awdry and Stanley Pickard, Kay and Ward's managing director. Draft contracts were drawn up and specimen lyrics written by Peter Reeves were submitted. But however, there was apprehension from the publishers and from the author, as the agreement being offered would give Lloyd Webber's company control of almost everything: idea, the characters, every one of the 26 books, and even anything else not yet written or published. Lloyd Webber's lawyers argued that such control was necessary in order to secure the investment money from America, which would be needed to pay for the animation and the filmmaking. The project looked decidedly uncertain, but in November 1974, Pickard advised Wilbert that he was maintaining personal contact with Andrew and still had a slight hope that there might be a way out. Wilbert remained apprehensive. Once the Americans get hold of it, the whole series would be vulgarized and ruined. And that eventually ended up happening. Guess Wilbert wasn't wrong. But anyways, eventually a contract was signed almost a year later and Wilbert was paid in advance of £500. Lloyd Webber ordered a pilot episode from Granada TV, spending some £10,000 to advance the project. Animator Brian Cosgrove, who would later be one of the founders of Cosgrove Hall Films, worked on the pilot, which would feature 2D cutouts of the engines moving along the backgrounds. The cutouts and backgrounds would be based upon illustrations from the Railway series, albeit in a unique Cosgrove style. This animation style was very similar to the animation style in the series Ivor the Engine. The pilot episode was completed in early 1977 and Lloyd Webber had really tried very hard to bring the project to fruition, but Granada ultimately decided not to produce a full series as they feared that Awdry's stories were not then popular enough outside the UK to justify investing the time and money needed to make the series. A real shame, really, that 2 attempts were made to bring Thomas and his friends to TV, and both ended up in disaster. But there's an old saying that goes, third time's the charm. Enter Britt Allcroft. In 1979, Britt Allcroft, a British television producer, was making a 5-minute documentary on the resurgence of interest in steam railways, part of which featured an interview with the Reverend Awdry at the Bluebell Railway. Prior to interviewing Awdry, Allcroft read some of the Railway series books and had become intrigued with the characters, stories, and illustrations. After dinner one evening, Allcroft told Awdry that she believed that his stories were made to be brought to life, and that she would like to be the one to do it. Awdry, however, replied that others had previously tried and failed to bring the Railway series stories to television. Nevertheless, in 1980, Allcroft negotiated television rights with Kay and Ward for £50,000, financed by getting a second mortgage on her family's Southampton home and loaning money from her local bank. Allcroft spent the next 2 years raising additional money for the production and meeting with different animators to decide on what type of animation would be used for the series. A solution was found when she met David Mitten, who had previously worked on shows such as Thunderbirds as a special effects technician. After having a meeting with him, the two of them decided to use radio-controlled models for the steam engines and other vehicles, with static but interchangeable faces and moving eyes. After getting a commitment from ITV, a low-budget pre-production test pilot episode based on the Railway series story Down the Mine was filmed. After the pilot episode was test screened on April 3rd, 1983, ITV greenlit a full series of 26 episodes. Allcroft was determined from the beginning to use a single narrator instead of a voice cast, and surprisingly, previous famous Railway series narrators such as Johnny Morris and Willie Rushton were rejected for the role. The story of how Allcroft found the narrator she was looking for is quite an interesting one. She recalled, "One Saturday night, the family were in the sitting room watching the Michael Parkinson show on television. I was not. I was pacing up and down wondering who I was going to find to be my storyteller. I was just passing the sitting room door when I heard a voice, and I thought, that is the voice of Thomas the Tank Engine storyteller. I put my head round the door and asked who it was. It was Ringo Starr. Yup, Ringo Starr himself, the former drummer of the Beatles." Allcroft reached out to Starr and met with him in autumn 1983, and he originally declined narrating the series since he had not read any of the Railway series books at that time. However, after reading the books, he changed his mind and decided to take on the role of narrating the series, signing on in December 1983. Upon hearing about Allcroft's endeavor, the manager of Starr's personal studio at the time, Mike O'Donnell, co-composed with Junior Campbell the opening theme music and submitted a demo to Allcroft, after which they were hired to compose the music for the series. Before Ringo was brought on to narrate the series, Wilbert's own son Christopher was grown up at this time and became a tax inspector for the English government, but he resigned from his job when he decided to continue his father's work writing the Railway series. The first story Christopher wrote for his first book was the story Triple Header, and just as Wilbert told Christopher the story of Edward's Day Out, Christopher told his story story to his own son Richard Awdry, and he quite enjoyed it. This book, titled Really Useful Engines, was published on September 12th, 1983. In terms of the TV series, the first season was filmed at Clearwater's in-house studio in Battersea, a suburb of London. It featured 25 episodes based on stories from the first 8 Railway Series books and a 26th episode written by Allcroft and Mitten, which they requested Awdry to publish as a companion book. The series was first broadcast from October 9th, 1984 to January 8th, 1985, and unlike the 2 previous attempts, saw great success due in part to the quality of the original Railway Series stories, Star's fame, and the live-action animation style. Some of Christopher's stories would even be used later on in future seasons, especially in seasons 2 and 4. However, as time continued to pass, Wilbur Awdry grew older and was mostly bedridden. On March 21st, 1997, Wilbur Awdry passed away at the age of 85. Even after his death, his works continued to be remembered both through the TV series and Christopher's books, which continued to be published all the way up until July 6th, 2011, when the final book, Thomas and His Friends, was published, bringing an end to the 66-year series. The legacy that the Railway Series left behind is truly something special. These books treated trains in a very different way as to how trains in children's media were usually portrayed around that time. In the era when the books were first published, trains were treated in this almost cartoony fashion, where they were able to jump off the tracks or move their bodies around in a way that they never would in real life. The Railway Series, however, treated the trains with a sense of grounded realism, in which the trains would be able to do something if it was within the realm of what a steam engine could actually do. Christopher Awdry even confirmed this in an interview.
You'll never find a story where, let us say, Thomas leaps off the rails and goes to rescue a sheep who's got stuck in a hedge, because engines don't do that.
This just goes to show how unique the Railway Series was for its time. It treated its subject matter in a completely realistic way, and that's what makes it stand out. It's different. I also love that the morals of the stories are never outright stated. The books treat their child audience with a level of respect to know what the moral is in a story without it being said outright. These books were written in a way that wasn't just for kids. It was written so that the adults reading the stories to their kids would enjoy it too, and Wilbur himself confirms that in an interview as well.
Well, when you're writing a children's book, you're writing for a whole lot of people. You're writing for yourself, to make sure that you've got it researched right. You're writing for the unfortunate parents who've got to read it aloud time after time after time after time. You've got to put in little funny bits, subtle bits, which they'll enjoy, and then there's the simple slapstick stuff which the child will enjoy.
There is something for everyone to enjoy in these books, and I think that, along with all the other reasons I stated earlier, are key parts as to why the Railway Series stands out. It treats its subject matter in a realistic way and doesn't feel like it panders directly to kids, and I think that Wilbur was a genius to write the stories in this general audience sense. No wonder why the books still continue to sell very well. Even today, they released a box set of all of Wilbur's books in 2014 for the 70th anniversary, and it's still available to purchase on Amazon. Christopher's books, however, are a lot harder to get a hold of since they aren't in print anymore, and that's a real shame. Some of them go for crazy prices on websites such as eBay and Amazon nowadays. Holy crap! Here's to hoping they get a box set release like Wilbur's books in the future. But anyways, the Railway Series left a big impact in more ways than just the books continuing to be sold to this day. The Tallyclyn Railway in Wales has currently hosted 4 Awdry extravaganzas, which are events that celebrate the legacy of Wilbur Awdry and the Railway Series, and all of them have proven to be be home run successes. Awdry used to work on the Talyklin Railway himself as a guard, and his time there is what inspired the stories for the Awdry Railway. It's really nice that they chose to host these extravaganzas at the railway that Awdry himself used to work on. The Railway Series, while it might be overshadowed by the more popular TV series, is what started it all, with numerous fans and volunteers on the Talyklin Railway keeping its legacy going. I am so thankful that Wilbert chose to publish these stories of his and share them with the world, because the world would definitely not be the same without these talking trains. Well guys, that about wraps it up for this video. This is a really fun video to work on, doing lots of research on the Railway Series' roots and how exactly it came to be. A lot of this info was taken from Wilbert Awdry's biography, The Thomas the Tank Engine Man by Brian Sibley, which I was lucky to get as a present a long time ago. It was also really fun to dive into the specifics of the 1953 sad story of Henry and the planned series by Andrew Lloyd Webber that never came to be. I really hope that you all enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it, as this video is a little different from every other Thomas video I've made, as it was Thomas related, but in a completely different way from the TV series. And one last thing before I end this video. If you followed my community posts and have been following me on Twitter, you'll know that I've been going on a collecting spree, collecting every single Christopher Awdry Railway Series book to scan the illustrations and use them in my own videos. Well, I'd just like to say that the scans for all of the books that I currently have at the moment, which are books 27 to 40, excluding book 39, are linked in the description for you guys to use in your own video projects. Feel free to do whatever you would like with them. Use them in your own videos, put them on the wiki, make edits with them, whatever you would like. They're my way of paying homage to this 80-year franchise, and I will definitely try my hardest to get my hands on the books I'm missing, so be on the lookout for those. Anyways, thanks for watching, and make sure to like and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this one. This is the TSMU fan, signing out.
I'm going out again tomorrow, he told the other engines that night in the shed. What do you think of that? But he didn't hear what they thought, for he was so tired and happy that he fell asleep at once.
Special thanks to my Patreon supporter, Master Painter, and I give an extra special thanks to those patrons of mine who have chosen to remain anonymous. If you'd like to learn how to get your name at the end of every new video that I upload, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Link is on my channel homepage under my channel description.